What up, students, and welcome to presentation 1.3, and I'm going to lay a word on you right out of the chutes, and the word is xenophobia, man. And xenophobia is a word that has Greek origins. It means fear of foreigners, fear of outsiders. Now, in the last presentation, I talked about Donald Trump, and Make America Great Again can be translated to the Ming concept of Make China Great Again. Well, here is a concept that I think Americans understand, this concept of fear of outsiders. Now, this fear in American contemporary America comes in many forms. You could be afraid of terrorism. In other words, a travel ban that keeps people from certain Islamic nations out. That's one. You could fear people coming up from Latin America and changing American culture. You could also fear international trade. So this concept of fear of foreigners is something that I think Americans, contemporary Americans, really understand. There's something else that's involved in this concept. It is the concept of a superior nature. In other words, you tend to look down on outsiders, and you tend to think that they might dilute your culture. Now, the early Ming monarchs were all about extending power, projecting Chinese power with the Ming fleets. Later Ming monarchs began to regret this decision, and they started to look at the outsiders as a threat instead of as an asset, something that's going to improve China. So they're going to, like many Americans would like to do today, shut down immigration, shut down interaction with the outside world. The Ming Dynasty lasted from 1368 to 1644, about 300 years, which, to be honest with you, is not that long in Chinese history. China has a long view of history, where Americans might think of 300 years as a long time. Chinese do not. And to a large extent, it was a successful dynasty, although short-lived. They accomplished two very important things. They got rid of the Mongols, Yuan Dynasty, kicked them out. They brought back Chinese pride, make China great again. But China suffered through something really odd. Climate change, believe it or not. They went through a mini ice age. You might remember this from the reading, which totally disrupted Chinese agriculture. And this is a large population that's hard to feed to begin with. Now, this created a power vacuum. And now the Ming must contend with two obstacles that Chinese dynasties have always had to contend with once they start to lose steam. And one is the emergence of powerful local provincial leaders, which is going to challenge the centralized Ming monarchs. The other thing, man, here we go again, external threats from China's traditional adversary to the north and to the west. The Ming Dynasty found itself in a vice, caught between external threats to the north and west and internal threats from provincial leaders who were asserting themselves. And then, man, in the 1590s, all of a sudden, Japan invades Korea. So this is a threat to the east. And Korea is considered like a buffer zone. It's considered an area that China wants to make sure it controls, make sure that there's not a hostile force there. And all of a sudden, this additional variable, this additional threat is piled on the others. Okay, dear students, I want you to think back to history 1181. Now, you might not remember this. If you do, bless you. But there was a caliphate, an Islamic caliphate called the Abbasid Caliphate, which was headquartered in Iraq. And they were being threatened by the Mongols, who were just on a roll in the 13th century. And they didn't think that they could withstand the Mongol horde. And so what they did is they relied on non-Arabs, outsiders, called the Mamluks, to try to stem the Mongol tide, and it worked. But the problem with relying on someone else to fight your battles for you is those who are victorious tend to try to dominate you afterwards. That's exactly what's going to happen in Ming China. They were in a vice, as I said, attacked on all sides, so they relied on some outsiders from Manchuria, an area just north and east of China, of Ming China. Now, the Manchus were different. They spoke a different language, but the Ming relied on them. They commissioned them to help the Ming defeat the Japanese, which they did, and of course, the Manchus took over. So, ultimately, their solution to the temporary problem became their downfall. So when the Manchus took over, they created something called the Qing Dynasty. Now look at these years, 1644 to 1911. People, this is the last Chinese dynasty. This goes all the way up into the 20th century. When we watch clips from this movie called The Last Emperor, that little kid is part of this dynasty. He is the last of the Qing monarchs. And just like what the Ming did, the Qing were successful in stabilizing the nation and securing the borders, but they did much more as well. Here is another way that this unit on China a long time ago is very similar to what's taking place in contemporary America. If you've been overseas, if you've been to an airport in another country, chances are it was pretty nice in comparison to American airports. If you've been on a train in another country, chances are it's pretty nice in comparison to American trains. If you've been on highways that were built in Europe, you might think, wow, these highways are a lot nicer than American highways. The fact of the matter is that American infrastructure is in desperate need of a facelift. Well, when the Qing monarchs came into China, they felt the same way about Chinese infrastructure. And if you build infrastructure, the citizens of your nation are grateful. And so what the Qing did, and it was beautiful, they went back to the Grand Canal of Xi Huangdi and they redid the whole thing, endearing themselves to many Chinese. Now, this one character that I want to emphasize is fascinating because he demonstrates a concept that has been in Chinese history forever, and you're going to see it when we watch The Last Emperor. Kangxi was the emperor from 1662 to 1722, but he made an interesting observation when he was about your age. See, in China, it is not unusual to name an emperor who is very young. And then this person is controlled by regents who are the de facto leaders of the nation. When he was a teenager, he came to the conclusion that his regents were actually manipulating him, and he had every one of them executed. Now, as you watch the movie The Last Emperor, you're going to see this unfold in much the same way in the 20th century. I imagine that you have heard the word overcompensation. That's when you try to adjust for an issue, but you do it too enthusiastically. You overdo it. Well, one thing about the Qing is they are not Chinese, they are Manchus. They are looked at as outsiders, much like the Mongols during the Yuan Dynasty. Your average Chinese person still considers them outsiders. So what they thought they would do is they thought they would out-xenophobe the Ming. In other words, they're going to be even more paranoid of outsiders than the Ming were. And they set up a system where they can control what comes into the nation. So they set up this port of Canton in southeastern China. All foreign products must funnel through this port. This becomes a hugely important phenomenon as we study China throughout this semester.